actually see is places where there are contrast changes. I would not see anything constant in that recreation. So the first level of processing that happens in your visual cortex is to identify contrast changes in space. All the constants, just ignore it. The vision system is also very good at filling in things. Okay? If you see, for example, the picture on the upper left, do you see a faint red circle over there? Do you see a faint red circle? Yes? Kind of. On the upper right, you see a blue square in between all the circles. Yes? Do you think it's there? It is not there. It is not there. It's what your brain is filling in. Your brain doesn't like discontinuities. Okay? In general, it doesn't like discontinuities. It likes to see complete structures. Okay? So whenever it gets a chance, if it collects enough evidence that there might be a complete structure somewhere, it's what it will provide as feedback to the vision system and say, no, that has to be a complete structure in there. Right? An incomplete structure would violate what we see or more commonly observe in a continuous world. And as a result, it will try to fill it in. Now, of course, if I, move the red spokes around just a little bit, all of a sudden you won't see the red circle anymore. Right? Because now there are discontinuities in those edges. Right? They're not aligned anymore. And as a result, the brain actually sees them as two separate objects now. Right? Doesn't need to provide a continuum to understand it. Okay? Same thing. Right? If I sort of define exactly where the contrast changes are, it will start breaking up. Doesn't need to create a full square within that anymore. Right? Now, again, if I actually keep the thing straight, but create breaks, create gaps between the red lines and the black lines, again I get a sense of two separate objects. Right? And I'm able to perceive it accordingly. So these are things that your brain actually does in order to alter what we think we perceive. Now, of course, these are what you may call illusions, or this is a way to understand what might be the limitations of just the vision system, right? And the limitations come primarily because of the fact that your brain is trying to fill in information that may or may not be there. Most of the times, it actually does a good job and fills in the right stuff, right? Only there are certain cases where it might falter in trying to provide a sense of generalized reality. Okay? Now let's come back to the optics of the eye. Right? In general, when we look at the optics of the eye, and people have studied the optics of the human eye for a long time in order to model artificial vision systems. Right? And the optics is fairly simple. The important optical structures that we have are fairly limited. You have the cornea, right, which is the outer covering of the eye. Right behind the cornea, you have the iris, which is actually a muscle structure that controls the pupil, right? Think of it as an aperture of how much light actually gets through to the sensors, the retina, okay? And behind that is your lens. Okay? The cornea is fixed structure, okay? The lens itself is quite flexible, right? Till we age, right? As we age, the structure becomes more and more rigid. But otherwise, for young eyes, the structure is very, very flexible and is able to bend itself in order to generate very, very high curvature, as well as stretch itself in order to make it as flat as possible. Okay? And that's what allows us to focus objects that might be at varying distances. Okay? So the basic optics is relatively simple. Now, of course, there is, if you will, a point of central fixation, which means that there is a line that joins the cornea, passes through the center of the iris, and connects back into your lens, which forms a straight line going back to the retina, which we call the optical axis, the optic axis. And in general, our eye, or the sensors behind on the retina, are fairly symmetric around that optic axis, except for the blind spot. Okay? So this is what the structure looks like. Now keep in mind, we have liquid both right behind the cornea and of course behind the lens. Okay? The purpose of this liquid is primarily to keep the shape. If there was no liquid, everything would just collapse onto itself. So the first purpose is to keep the shape, and the second purpose is to continuously provide nutrients to the sensors and the cells that are present. Okay? Now, the optic nerve is where all your sensors come together as a bundle. So the back portion here is the retina. Okay? Retina has photoreceptors among other cells. All of them send out signal. They come together as a bundle at the optic nerve and transfer that nerve back to your visual cortex. Okay? Now, of course, where all the sensors come together and forms the optic nerve, we have no ability to see because there are no sensors there. Okay? So that's what we typically call the blind spot. Now, your eyes, the optic axes are such that they are actually not, parallel to each other. They actually converge at a point in front of us, and the optic axis is offset towards the temple. Okay, so it's 5-degree offset towards the temple. The cornea itself forms the main refractive structure for us, okay, and has a very, very high index of refraction. It's in fact almost equal to water. The reason for that is because the eye essentially wants to collect as much light as it can. Right? So having a high refractive index means we are able to bend rays of light more, right? The higher the refractive index, the higher the bending power. You can think of it that way. So having a high refractive index for the cornea allows us to actually sample light from directions that are not just entirely straight, but peripheral to us. Okay? So it allows us to collect as much light as possible. The iris, of course, is there so that if there is too much light, it will contract and minimize how much of it is sent through the lens. Okay? Of course, if there's very little light, it will open up wide, it will dilate. Okay? So it serves as an aperture for your optic system. The lens itself will bend depending on what you're focusing on. Right? So if you're looking at something very close, it'll bend itself a lot, right? Because you need to project a fairly decent sized object very close to you so that it can fall and project itself onto the retina, right? So the sensors can sense it. If you're looking at an object that is very far, obviously it's not going to appear very large in size, so the lens doesn't have to curve itself all that much in order to project it back onto the retina, so it stays flatter. Okay? The transmittance of light is also important. So, our vision system, we typically see things in the visual spectrum, right? Remember we talked about the EM range, the EM spectrum, that's very wide, right? And we sense a very, very narrow range of wavelengths within that. Right? Your eye can only see a certain narrow range of wavelengths. So the amount of wavelength that gets transmitted through the cornea is generally going to be above 320 or so nanometers. Everything under that, it doesn't send through. So the transmittance curve of the cornea itself is such that everything under that wavelength, it will cut off. everything that is under 3